Welcome to Law and Justice. I'm Jane Mulcahy. This is a special series on the topic of relationships matter. And today I'm very excited to be joined by Professor Huw Williams. Hi, Huw. How are you?
I'm very good, thank you. Good morning.
Thanks so much for taking the time to speak to me, Huw. To begin with, can you just tell me a little bit about yourself, please, and your background?
Yeah, sure. I'm a clinical neuropsychologist and I work at the University of Exeter and I'm a clinical academic and for most of my career, I've looked at intellectual disability or brain trauma, neurodisability issues, and in particular looking at communication issues, mood problems and impact of brain injury, particularly on how people are able to navigate in the social world, which is the world in so many ways, isn't it? It's kind of tough for people if they can't navigate effectively. Yeah.
Thanks, Huw. And so as a neuropsychologist, what's your own understanding or your understanding from the field of the importance of relationships and especially the quality of our attachment to our primary caregiver in infancy and early childhood?
Well, that's a really interesting one because the emerging, as a neuroscientist, I suppose I would say, well, it's really interesting, these micro behaviors of attachment. So early on are really interesting and important. There's a huge amount of work around how, touching, being held, loving kindness in actions from a parent towards a child is associated with the abilities to develop trust and self-soothing and those important inner self-regulatory type skills, but also be able to trust in the world and so on. And the work of Brian Kolb, for example, is really interesting on that in animal models, and the work of Helen Sharp in developmental neuroscience psychology is really good on that. So it's interesting from a point of view of the actual behaviors, the micro behaviors that enable kids to develop and internalize skills. And I'm also a Vygotsky based psychologist, which means I tend to think about how the world comes into you and is represented and so on. There's a Dylan Thomas quote, "I learned man's tongue to twist the shape of thoughts," which is a very Vygotskian thing. You take into yourself, what's out there. And specific in my area, then you see there's a double whammy for kids who grow up in neglect and abuse and so on. So not only is the sort of parenting is absent, or appropriate parenting is absent for developing the pro-social type skills, but also there's fearfulness and reactivity and the risk of having kind of brain injury. So it's pivotal, really. It's an incredibly important time of life for those foundation stones. Yeah.
And so I'm aware from having met you at this GLEFA neurodiversity group that you're involved in an awful lot of fascinating research on traumatic brain injury and neurodiversity. Do these matters have a relational dimension, Huw, or impact?
Oh, massively. So if you, again, if you look at the early period of life, under 5, there's you're 5 times more likely to have a brain injury if you're from the poorest 5% of society and you're under 5. So 555. So relationships at the macro level of in society, access to resources, parents able to have the resources, have good public transport, all these things are important at that end, but also injuries to the brain lead to changes in the social brain network, and the social brain network is complex. But if you think about some of the elements in brain functions you need for behavior, to be able to understand another person's perspective, to be able to react to another person's emotions effectively and quickly, rather than a lag, so that it's appropriate, to be able to hold back your own emotions, which may be anger or disappointment or grief, whatever it might be, but then hang on to that and then say the right thing. So the kind of social brain network, there's a system called the fusiform diary about face kind of processing, and then pulling emotions out of the face, the amygdala, then holding that in mind as you're kind of in your working memory, the hippocampal system, the prefrontal cortex for being able to then decide on the best action, but a lot of that is subconscious because you kind of behave. We don't think about how we socially engage necessarily very much. We just do it, right?
Yeah.
So we're on automatic, and so when people have brain injuries, which are incredibly common, those parts of the system can be affected, or the whole system is affected. So there's an effect across brain systems. So there's a less capacity to do that. And when we look at kids who've had brain injuries, they lag behind other kids quite dramatically in the teenage years around being able to really process what's going on around them, and it leads to problems in schooling because they might misbehave, but they just don't know how to enact appropriately sometimes, or they become quiet and shy and into the background and drift, and both things can lead to school exclusion. And one of our big worries is the way in which they're hoovered up by the negative agents, the crime groups and so on. So so that's a vulnerability route out of schools and into trouble, but they are drifting because they haven't got the awareness of how to do and how to manage things. So yeah, so it's a social aspect there is incredibly important because it's what gets seemingly it's an incredibly important aspect that then is affected. But then also in recovery terms, we've done work looking at people across a range of brain trauma. And one of the key factors in people retaining good self-esteem years down the line and life satisfaction is the continuation of some parts of their social network or new parts of the social network where they feel they can talk to people in a way that's trusted and they feel understood. So it's that and that's probably related to having that sort of sense of being being able to have a life narrative after a traumatic event, but also is to do with having a degree of acceptance and so on over an identity that might be stigmatized. So it's interesting how the social dimension is incredibly important, both from the neurological behavioral side to the recovery side.
Sure. It's very interesting. Thanks, Huw. And just with the under fives and their risks for brain injury, especially if they're in socially deprived areas, what type of things would happen to them? Is it mainly falls. Or could it falls?
Yeah, falls, yeah. And then non-accidental injuries. So when we've looked at it from in our emergency department, we catalogued 4 times a year for a couple of weeks a year, specifically what happened to kids across the age groups and so on. And falls and accidental injuries were the big ones for moderate to severe brain injuries. So that's the worrying aspect of that, is that people tend to think of, kind of head injury in kids or young as things to not really be too worried about because, recover from that, fine. But no, there's a lot of falls and so on, and minor brain injury, minor head injuries in the young population. But also there's a hell of a lot of moderate to severe brain injuries. So the big spike in brain injuries happens under 5s and then in the teenage years. And those are consequential, but they're very silent because this is at a time where you're not verbalizing, don't know the difference. And then you went to school and your trajectory is already a little bit affected. And the comparison with kids where there's the same kind of injury in a kid where there's more resources and so on, the outcomes are much more improved because there's people who can navigate and enable and do the micro-parenting because you haven't got the 2 jobs or whatever it is, so it's kind of, they can focus the resources. So it's tough.
And I'm a mom of 2 children myself, a girl and a boy. I'm just wondering, are boys more likely in the under 5s as well as the teenage years?
No. I'm a dad of 2 as well, so a boy and girl, and now towards the end of the adolescence period, and well, there's so many things that go on, isn't there? But there's in under 5s the rates of injury are the same, boys and girls.
Okay.
So that sort of tells you that it's not about necessarily much to do with risk-taking behavior in the kid. It's more about the environment they're in.
Right, that's very interesting.
But adolescent brain injuries starts to get much more into the adolescent risk-taking behavior, which really kicks in around 13. So you're 13, 14, when your reward system is now fully up to speed, and the want system is now fully up to speed, and what you want is what you want, and when you want to get it when you want it. But your systems for managing that and prioritizing and so on is not yet kind of adequately developed. For the managing of the wants. And then there's a massive differential between girls and boys at that point, or young people at that point, huge difference.
I read an article by David Dobbs called Beautiful Brains a few years ago, and one of the things he was talking about was to do with boys and driving behaviors, speed in the teenage years. And I've mentioned this to you before, that from my own PhD research, and I wasn't looking at it really, except that several of the men had dangerous driving behaviors in their teens and beyond. And is that a feature that often, particularly say, boys and men who end up in the prison system, would dangerous driving type issues and perhaps head injury from that?
Yeah. Well, that's a very interesting point, actually, and there's a number of things to pull out of that. I mean, so I guess talking a bit more about brain injury. Brain injury is the biggest cause of death and disability in people under 40. And now we know it's associated with increased risk of dementia. So basically, if you peel things back from a brain injury perspective, you start to find, it is the biggest cause of poor long-term health issues globally, because we haven't really been even counting the numbers properly in mid and low-income countries, right? So it is just massive as an epidemiological issue. Then down to then in the teenage years, I mean the factors that are associated with increased risk of crime, particularly violent crime, which is brain injury is a standout risk factor independent of anything else. So if you look at various studies in this area, as I've had to over the last few years, what you find is that in epidemiological studies where it's national register studies, so this is like Sweden, where all the records that are available in health and violence, you find about 2.5% of Swedes become violent offenders at some point. But then if there's a brain injury in their hospital records, then 9% of them become violent offenders at some point. But then if you look at the siblings of the violent brain injured offenders, about 4.5% of them become violent offenders. There is socio-economic, familial risk factors at play in some, and then when the brain injury happens, it doubles your risk. If there aren't those risk factors already, then your trajectory is shifted ×3 towards crime. And when you think about crime, it's about criminalizing behaviors that are due to disability. So that's so it's just so ironic, because you end up, the studies we've been doing with women in prison in particular really exemplify this. So women in prisons in Scotland we've been doing work with, and more than 60% have had a brain injury at some point. Most of these brain injuries, when they have the worst ones, are in their late teens, early 20s in the women, and many are due to intimate partner violence. And the behaviours that come to the police attention and court attention are being really off publicly,
noisy and disorderly and
basically disorderly behaviour in public spaces, that sort of thing, on repeat. And then there's the unpaid fines due to, and then there's the involvement in drugs, but that's usually because they're being forced to be part of the drug world and so on and so forth. So it's horrendously, it's an example of what we find in general, that there's these are people on the whole who are vulnerable, who are then utilized by others for their own ends, effectively. And so that's why it's it's a particular concern in terms of what do we do socially. We need to be, this is a policing issue to some extent, but also a social fabric welfare set of issues. So that's and so to your question about the teenagers and driving as a factor, road traffic accidents, thankfully that, you know, we've got airbags and all the rest of it, but there's it's still a big issue because it's an issue of impact at speed and the head moving around and the brain moving around and the shearing forces. So it's rotational shear forces on the brain. So the more an adolescent gets injured in a more high impact type event, being, you know, an assault or anything like that, then the higher the chances that there's going to be problems down the line. It's been creating aggression and criminality. Whereas if it's something more like a sports injury, then, you know, very unlikely, incredibly unlikely. It's just sort of, you know, well, that's, you know, not consequential. But also if you're in sports, typically, well, in the UK, but for example, you're inside a bit of a bubble of support as well. You know,
the social
from
network.
the medic, yeah, from the medic running on, the parents being concerned, the school thinking, oh, and looking after. So it's like, so they're very. But the you know, some of the kids that we weren't young people we work with in our studies, they may have multiple head injuries in the same day in gang fights. You know, and there's no medic running on the field then, is there?
No, it does not. Yeah. And the community isn't maybe particularly concerned about those young people's
well-being. The community are going, just leave you to get on with it.
Yeah, you brought it on yourself maybe as well. You
chose. There's that as well. And then you mentioned adolescence and driving. The other big thing obviously is peers, and then and the ability to be able to hold off the influence of peers is very difficult for a teenager. Very, very hard, because the identity is forming. I mean, it's tough. That age period is really tough, because you're having to not cave into the pressure of those around you. So if you've got another person in the car, you're more likely to drive, you know, kind of in a risky way, etc. So it's like you're more likely to do things that will bring you, you know, to the potential grief. So it's tricky.
Well, just some of the young boys or teenagers in one study that we're looking at the moment, they kind of frequently joyride around their areas at high speed and go off, guard car chases and this type of thing.
I can well imagine.
Dr. Nadine Burke-Harris and the Center for Youth Wellness in California, when they started routinely screening the children in the clinic for adverse childhood experiences, found that those with 4 or more of them were 32 times more likely to be diagnosed with ADHD compared with kids with none of them. Huw, are you familiar with other research which establishes a correlation between childhood adversity, toxic stress, and ADHD or other neurodevelopmental conditions?
Well, it's interesting you should ask, actually, because it's good that people are looking at these things. There are probably going to be some adverse childhood experiences that are going to be more likely to trigger a cascade effect, and also to be indicative of environments that are particularly problematic. So sexual abuse is one. I mean, that's in particular, sort of neglect might be, and so on. So as I mentioned, there's work in the neurosciences around brain development where there is certainly evidence around the absence of parenting, positive parenting. So the ACEs work is interesting because at an epidemiological level, yes, it makes sense. But then at the individual or formulation level, we're looking at a person, then you need to think about, well, which ACEs are here. And so there's work to be done around which ones are particularly strong indicators of long-term social behavioral issues. And in some of our work, what we're doing is we're trying to tease apart some of the factors that are to do with early trauma experiences, traumatic brain injury, and adolescence, young adult behavior. This is work we're doing. This is work we're doing in South Africa, largely at the moment, and my colleague Lee Schiff. And the interesting thing is that it's not a one or the other; it's going to be both. So, if you think about it, the kid who's kind of traumatized is probably getting slapped, and the neglect is leading to falls and so on. So what we've found we did publish a paper relatively recently around how the absence of positive parenting is another risk factor for having a head injury, and then that head injury is a factor in later entry into criminal justice system and school failure and so on. So these are interactional factors. And the message public policy wise is we need to address how to support parents across childhood into adolescence and young adulthood, because your job doesn't stop. And actually when you get this,
it's harder, probably.
Yeah, it's harder. I often say this, but if as a parent, would you think twice or three times before putting something about your kids up on Facebook after they're 12 or 13? Yes, you would, because you've gone through the nice period and you're now into the period. And it's not just about their sense of privacy. It's also that, oh gosh, that's what to do about this. So there's and which is, we've all been there. We've all been teenagers. So we were all probably going, oh God, that was something not to broadcast. Yes. But now kids have their lives so exposed in so many ways, and that's problematic. So I think it's interesting how kids with a neurodevelopmental disorder navigate their way, really, and what kind of support they can get to manage all this stuff, which is now like amplified by all the social media stuff as well.
Indeed. You mentioned some of your research on traumatic brain injury in the prison context with the female prison population. Do you also have some research with males? And if you do, what were some of the key findings there?
Most of the work actually has been with young men. A number of studies in young offender institutions and prisons here in the UK, and then working alongside our colleagues in France and South Africa as well. And the overall trend is, if you imagine that about 1 in 10 of people in general society have had a brain injury at some point, and that might be a mild brain injury, a brief loss of consciousness, through to 1 in 100 or 2 in 100 have had a more substantial brain injury. So you've been knocked out for 20-30 minutes or more, and your life has been very much changed by that, because you're not so good at remembering stuff anymore. Your personality is a bit changed. Your attention and concentration isn't as good, and you've struggled with work, etc. Right? So you have those in mind. In prison populations, it's about 60% have had a brain injury. 60.
Wow.
Yeah, and it's usually higher than that, depending on the study you look at. In our studies, it's around 65%. But then what we did, which was different to most of the studies, we looked at severity of injury. So what we then looked at was, well, how many have had, more mild injuries and repeated mild injuries, how many have had moderate, severe injuries, and so on. So what we found is that about 40 to 50% have mild brain injuries, and about 16 to 20% have moderate severe brain injuries. Okay. So 2 in 10 people in prison have really have had long-term, behavior understanding is affected because of brain injury. Another 3 to 4 in 10 have a degree of that. And the degree of that depends on how often they've had these mild brain injuries, which could be 10 minutes loss of consciousness, which is substantial, actually. It's what we now call complicated brain injury. So the population of people who are in our studies with 16-year-olds on average, through to our studies with adults, the vast majority have had some form of neurodisability from brain injury.
And I presume prisons the world over do not screen for traumatic brain injury upon committal.
Well, the word committal, that's coming into the prison, right? So there's it's interesting. It's changing.
Okay.
So in the UK, there's in large part there is the understanding that everybody should be screened. So all the young people coming into young offender systems are now screened for brain trauma and neurodisability. And we now have a new system called a secure stair system, which is a trauma-informed way of working. So now I think probably up to a third, maybe up to a half of kids come in now, young people come into, now are coming into more therapeutic environments rather than incarceration with a bit of schooling. They're coming more into therapeutic environments where there's more understanding of brain injuries and trauma and so on. Okay. But in some places like New Zealand, there's new systems been put in place at the court level. So if the judges will take things into account, and that's really good to see. And in some parts of the US, it's happening as well. So there's and in some parts of Europe. So I mentioned France. There's more screening happening within prisons and so on. So and in France, it's the Ministry of Health that seem to be particularly important in prison. So it shifts things. Okay. And I guess the interesting thing around the brain injury is that it's an interesting neurodisability because it's something which is potentially progressive, because it's not something which you just have and that's it, it's done. It leads to brain inflammation that could then continue to affect you for months and years, especially if you have another injury, and you're more likely to have another injury if you have one already, especially if you're then not very good at social navigation and get another injury, right? So in terms of the way in which very recently, actually about a year ago or maybe a bit more, the United Nations Convention on the Rights of the Child was revised, a new commentary where they took on board evidence from my colleagues and I on how common neurodisabilities were in children and young people who are in detention, and the need to address their issues. But they went a step further and said that more needs to be done to stop children and young people like this entering into the criminal justice system to begin with. So that's now a UN Convention on the Rights of the Child, which 187 member states should be doing something about. Yeah, it's very important. And just this week as well, the Scottish Sentencing Council issued a guideline calling for 18 to 25, or sorry, up until the age of 25 to have their maturity taken into account, as well as trauma histories and all of that, which I presume is a positive step, Huw. Massive. So should have mentioned that when I say UK, that there's the systems of England, Wales, and Northern Ireland separately, and then Scotland. And Scotland's there's been some nice work in Scotland. Tom McMillan, my colleague there, has been so involved with that in bringing through more screening, deciding what's the best way of screening, but then what's the follow-up, what's the rehab that comes from that, and how that changes the, what happens next. And you're absolutely right. It's really great that there's this consideration of up to 25, because these are transition points in life where the brain is still developing to some extent, but it's a massive transition point socially and emotionally and familially and all that kind of stuff. So it's incredibly important to consider maturity. And I guess back to the neurodisability and diversity and brain injury aspect, these are factors that delay change trajectory. So and it's associated with, unfortunately, more violent crime, but it tends to be impulsive, poor decision making at a time where your emotions got the best of you. So it's like and also being goaded by people to this, it's a poor social skills and so on, that's mentioned with the women. So it's kind of what we need is more social communication, understanding, more speech and language therapists involved in at early on, and magistrates and judges picking up on these issues and designing interventions that actually rehabilitate. And thank you. That was news to me that the Scots have gone another step forward in being so enlightened as they tend to just this week. So it is kind of exciting. And I'm sure because they're saying focus more on rehabilitation, it would make sense that must extend to young people with traumatic brain injuries and other disability. I'm conscious of your time, but just one on police officers, because at one of the conversations we were part of, I think it was possibly the LEF conference, I was interested to learn that police officers
have quite high rates of brain injury. Is that right,
Yeah.
Huw?
Yeah. Well, my PhD student Nick Smith, he did a study with me and Thames Valley Police, and this is the first actual study. It was a pilot or prevalence study of brain injury in police. So it's a few caveats there because it's a preliminary study. And so it's surprising to me that there hasn't been studies, because there's lots of studies in the military, lots of studies in sports and so on, and lots of studies. But so so about 30% of police officers have had some kind of brain injury, and it tends to be mild brain injury, disproportionately. So the vast majority are mild.
Okay.
But having said that, quite a few of the injuries were sustained in policing, so being assaulted by members of the public, right. High-speed car chases. So it's something that happens with the job, but also coming into the job from having been in the military, and so on as well. But also maybe, in some cases with sports and so very much kind of sports type. But an interesting aspect was the links between brain injury and PTSD. So it's harder. I mean, my previous work was on PTSD and brain injury. It's harder for somebody who's had a brain injury to develop a self-narrative and to move away from the trauma, in a sense, and get a coherent sense of what's going on. So recoveries from a traumatic event is harder when you've got brain injury, and that was part of what we found with the police, that can you imagine going into an intimate partner violence situation and you're trying to stop one person doing something, and then the other person who was the victim is now attacking you, and you feel and so on. So it's a very complex environment. So we and over time, it's the more people have been enrolled for quite a while, and also there's other forms of PTSD in the police dealing with chronic stress type issues to do with exposure to violence and sexual violence, and that sort of thing. So it's an interesting area. I think we need to be thinking, from a trauma-informed perspective, we need to be thinking about what the officers are also experiencing, and how to help them to manage their emotions in these high emotive sort of situations.
It's a fascinating area, because as you say, the combination of the injury itself, the PTSD, then the constant interaction with activating subject matter and hypervigilance and all of that is quite
and drinking to pump.
Combustible, of course, and engage in self-care in a healthy way rather than maybe medicating with alcohol or whatever else. Last question, Huw. What can politicians and policymakers do to promote safe, healthy relationships among people who have a neurodevelopmental issue or who have experienced traumatic brain injury?
Right. Well, that's a
big question.
Last but not least, huh? Well, I think it's realizing that it's not an issue that's going away. It's an issue that's been revealed through all the data from different jurisdictions and perspectives, and we're all there's a huge amount of agreement in around these issues by now, when we know that these are very prevalent and problematic kind of issues. And I guess it's one element is finding the ability to be empathic towards those who have ended up or may be at risk of ending up in the criminal justice system, particularly in the future, if we don't act sooner. So earlier intervention, earlier in life, earlier in the process of criminalization or disability, so we don't do that. Particularly improving school systems. I get absolutely livid around school exclusion levels. It's just absolutely horrendous. And the lack of care taken around training up teachers, training up people in education around disability in general and neurodisability in particular, and how to really support kids who struggle, especially in the transition period. And I think a more holistic approach towards these issues needs a bit more sophistication from our politicians from point of view of integrating across, in the UK, but across ministries, joined up work. So spend more on education, save more on criminal justice, save more for the taxpayer. We have done economic analysis. These have been kind of looked at, but the problem is that they have to really try to engage with that process of using our capital more effectively in the long range and taking the long view. I think there's some really good models being developed around this as well, and there are some people really taking that, as I mentioned, the trauma-informed systems being developed, but they need to become mandatory. Rather than just flavor of the month, rather than 8 days or trauma-informed being flavor of the month, there needs to be that this actually is meaningful. And the key aspect, one of my public health colleagues mentioned the other day, was how people need to understand that having a neurodisability or a drug disorder where you're self-injecting and so on are not a small part of this population for whom we need to find some specialist staff to come in and help. They are the population. This is the population that we are trying to somehow support, so they can have less difficult lives, and therefore their difficult lives aren't impacting on other people's lives, right? So that's why we need frontline workers who are properly supported day in, day out, to be able to deal with the difficulties of engaging with people who frankly have greater difficulties in engaging and talking and understanding what's going on in their lives. So we need that sort of commitment, I think. And in some parts of the world, in New Zealand, they're really, looking at that seriously, how to do it. Scotland, as you mentioned, Wales, there's some really nice initiatives kind of coming through, the enhanced intervention approaches for kids, for example. They need to be properly embedded. This is what we do. And why do we do it? We want to enable people who are vulnerable to be able to stay in society, because that's the best place for people every which way around. We want to reduce violent crime. Violence is terrible and it's expensive. So, it's horribly expensive. Grievous bodily harm costs £300,000. A murder costs £2.5 million. These are expensive, so we need to continue the work to show, well, look, it's not just a compassionate and sensible thing to do; it's also the sensible thing to be doing. So from I guess those are some of the messages, but it's doable. And the rehabilitation really needs to mean rehabilitation, not here's 10 episodes of anger management or something, kind of once week. We need to be, with this brilliant technology, there's wonderful ways that we can help, with apps of less than £5 or whatever is your currency. It's kind of, it's so much technology that we can use in this area that's non-punitive but supportive. It's all there, it's all available.
Okay. Professor Huw Williams, thank you so much for your time. I really enjoyed our chat. This has been Relationships Matter with me, Jane Mulcahy, and my guest today was Professor Huw Williams. Wearing
a top sent to me by my mother yesterday, because she knows I'm going to a Wales against Australia match.
Nice one. Yeah, I love it. It's a lovely colour and very proud. Thanks, Huw.
Right.